This is Blaine Bartlett. This episode is a reprise edition of one of the very first interviews I did for this podcast back in 2019. I'm republishing it now in honor of an extraordinary human being, Elisabet Sahtouris. She was an evolution biologist, futurist author, speaker, and consultant on living systems design. Elisabet used nature's principles in practice revealed in biological evolution as useful models for organizational change. She applied them in the corporate world, in global politics, and in economics, in our effort to create sustainable health and well-being for humanity within the larger living system of Earth. She passed away on her own terms on December 1st, 2024, and will be dearly missed. This episode is well worth your time. Hello, and welcome to The Soul of Business with Blaine Bartlett. I am your host, Blaine Bartlett, and I want to welcome a very special guest today. But before I do so, I want to give a bit of a preamble as to what this program is about. It's called The Soul of Business for a reason. Everything on this planet, literally, I believe everything in this universe, is created out of a source. There's a spark, there's a spirit, there's a soul that informs what we are and what we have and what we touch and what we see in this universe. And what we see is what we, in what we call reality. And the soul of business is no exception. Business has a soul. It's been my experience in the last 40 years of my work in businesses as a consultant and as a coach and as a business entrepreneur myself, that far too often businesses lose connection to that soul. And the consequences of that are pretty dramatic and pretty consequential, if I could use that word, in a negative sense. The soul speaks to something that is connected, and all of life is connected. I grew up on a farm, and one of my biggest teachers growing up on the farm was nature, and just noticing how everything was interdependent and how one thing happening or something happening to one area on the farm had consequences systemically on the rest of the farm. Whether it was the animals that we were working with or the crops that we were growing, whatever it was all impacted. So that carried forward into my sensibility in terms of how I was running my businesses and also how I consulted. So this program, The Soul of Business, is an invitation to the listener to explore what does it mean to actually be connected to that spirit. And then as a leader in a business, how do I actually leverage that connection so that my business becomes a force for good, not just a source of profit. So that's the preamble and the raison d'etre, if you will, for why this program exists. And it's been my great joy and honor to be able to interview some fascinating people in the pursuit of exploring this topic. And today's episode is no exception. I came across this woman through some of the work that I do with an organization called the World Business Academy. And I am a board director on the Academy and have been for a number of years. I'm also Dean of Education at the World Business Academy. And I was talking with the founder, Ronaldo Brudico, who is a very good friend of mine, about different things. And he mentioned this person's name. And I said, I have not come across her. And he said, well, how could you have not? She's a fellow in the business or in the Academy. And I said, I better do my homework. So I went in and started looking around, and I was gobsmacked, to take a British term here, at what I discovered. Elisabet Sahtouris is literally, I think, the most impactful and influential evolutionary biologist of our time. And what's interesting about this particular interview for me is how she positions what she does from her background in terms of what the future of the world can be and what the future of humankind can be. She considers, and I was struck by this in her biography, that she's a deep pastist, what she calls a pastist. And I need to be a deep pastist in order to be a good futurist. And she truly is a futurist in the truest sense of the word here. Knowing our human evolutionary trajectory helps us see the best options laying ahead in the world that works for all. She has spoken on 5 continents, teaching living economies, which is what we're going to be talking about today, as well as how to navigate our perfect storm of crises. As you know, we start becoming more interconnected. Conflict is inevitable in one sense, but how we deal with that conflict is something that we can actually address, and I think in a very generative fashion. Elisabet has post-doctoral degree at the American Museum of Natural History. She's taught at M.I.T, the University of Massachusetts. She's contributed to Nova's Horizon TV series, and as I mentioned, she's a fellow of the World Business Academy with an honorary chair in living economies. And she's also on the board of an interesting organization called Ethical Markets, which has been around for over 40 years. And I think it's worth touching on this. Ethical Markets' mission is to foster the evolution of capitalism beyond current models based on materialism, thereby maximizing self-interest and profit, competition, and fear of scarcity. It's about looking at a different way to use capitalism in a more generative way. Capitalism, in my experience, has gone off the rails. And that was part of the reason that I wrote the book, Compassionate Capitalism, A Journey to the Soul of Business. So I want to welcome Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris to the show. I am thrilled and honored to have you here. Elisabet, welcome.
Thank you so much, Blaine. It's my pleasure to be able to have this conversation with you.
Well, I'd like to start off, and the conversation is what I'd like to have. Pretty much the format of this show is not to be an interview style. It really is conversational. So these conversations are generally sparked by questions. So I'll just ask a question that I was curious about. How does the spirit or soul, in my vernacular, how does a spirit or soul enter into conversation about businesses' roles or responsibility in creating living economies? How does that come to pass? What's the role of spirit in this process from a business perspective?
Yeah, well, that's a big question, Blaine, and wow, there are several ways I would approach this. One is that we share the childhood in nature, the recognition that everything is connected. And I remember that when I couldn't climb a tree high enough to get to a woodpecker I wanted to see, I could take my mind up to be with the woodpecker. I was able as a child to commune with things in nature, not just to communicate. And I make that distinction between the way the cells in my body know what each other are doing. They know what the whole system is about. They know their role. And this is true of every ecosystem. But humans have told ourselves that we can't commune. We kind of stamp it out in children.
Yes.
And they can only communicate, and we teach them to put everything in the boxes of this is fact and this is fiction, right? And if you experience something and talk about it and it doesn't fit the social model, then you're lying. Your imagination has run away with you. We try to stamp it out. But I'm seeing this communion coming back in children and not being stamped out the way it used to be. And it's a birthright that we have. When we can commune with things, I don't even want to call them things, because that's an awful noun to use in a living economy, in a living sense. But business has suffered from this same kind of proscription. We've set our businesses up as hierarchies, and everybody's put into the boxes, and this is what you do and this is what you do, and here are your timelines, and we have to be very, very efficient so that we can maximize the products, the profits from the products, right? So I used to think that businesses weren't even living systems, and then I remembered, hey, they're made of people. They're made of people who are connected, interconnected. Their lives are interconnected, even though they're taught, leave your life at home. When you come into the business, you're in the business world, right? And you have all these tasks to do. So we lose the soul because the soul is in the communion, in the
Perfect.
interconnectedness.
There's two pieces there, and communion and communication are two very distinct activities. And that being said, relationship, listeners to this show have heard me say this before, but any organization is a collection of individuals that are in relationship. And to the degree that all of these relationships are working well, the organization's probably going to function fairly healthily. And the default for many people when they hear me say that is the interpersonal relationships. Yeah, but there's relationships that I have with the rest of the system. There's relationships that I have with the goals and objectives, the work process. All of these things have relationship dynamics to them. I have relationships with stakeholders. I have relationships with the abstract market. And if I'm not attending to, and this is where communion comes in, I believe, if I'm not attending to the qualitative nature of those relationships, I'm missing incredible opportunities to be not only efficient, but effective in terms of being generative and life-affirming rather than pulling from the system without recompense, if that makes sense.
Right.
So the idea of communion in a business context, in a business conversation, seems a little foreign, I think, to many business listeners. So how would you address that? How would I be positioned to have communion? Not in a liturgical way, but how does that work?
Well, let's play with that a little bit. I'm an evolution biologist, as you said, but I'm also was always interested in cosmologies and worldviews and recognizing that each of us has a worldview. I came to call them vistas because vista is made of two overlapping shorter words, vita and visa, right? You slide them together, you get the word vista. And vita means life, and visa gets where you want to go, right? So if you want to look at our worldviews are collections of beliefs about ourselves, about our worlds, about relationships or not, about whether things are independent objects connected by actions, which in our kind of language, the Indo-European languages are all made of nouns and verbs. Most indigenous languages are process languages that see everything in motion and in flow. And you're very connected in China, so you will also know that from the Taoist, the ancient Taoist perspective in China, is everything is only relationship in flow, constantly evolving.
True.
The yin-yang symbol is my favorite symbol. It shows the inward spiraling, to me, of gravitation and the outward spiraling of radiation coming together, like if you do it in a donut and you rotate the donut on itself, there's a white hole on one side spitting out the radiation, and on the other side there's a black hole sucking it back in, right?
Rodeo.
They're talking a lot in the news about black holes right now, and they say anything that goes into a black hole can never come out. But we know from Stephen Hawking and Nassim Haramein and all sorts of people that they do emit light, that from the event horizon of a black hole, the light is spewing forth. Anyway, I bring up Taoism because in the Taoist model, there is matter, there is energy, there is spirit. And they're all connected. They move in and out of each other. And all physicists, even Western physicists that have rather mechanical models, are agreeing nowadays with the quantum physicists that everything is vibration. So think of a keyboard where the Taoist matter is in the low keys, and then the energy is in the mid-range. And Einstein showed us that matter and energy can be transposed up and down the keyboard. They're really the same thing, aren't they?
Yes.
But Western science gets stuck trying to derive the universe from the matter end, because it insists that things have to be measurable to be real, and it can only make measuring instruments out of matter. So it gets stuck when it gets to energy. It gets up to 0 point energy, we call it.
Yeah.
Now, the Eastern philosophies like Taoism and Vedism all start at the high end of the keyboard in cosmic consciousness. In Sir James Jean's comment, the universe is more like a great thought than a great machine. So they start in that realm of consciousness and thought, and by slowing down the vibrations, they get to energy and then transforming into matter. So we've been taught from Western science to look at business through Western science's model of evolution, which is only Darwinian competition, right?
Yep.
And so
let me hold just a minute here. I'm going to put a pause because I've got a dog barking. My apologies, Elisabet.
You gave us a glimpse of the picture behind you, which seems to be a Chinese painting of two figures, maybe yin yang, male female. I don't know.
Actually, that's an erte that is two dancers. That kind of doing, So
right, but there's always the inward and the outward, right? And that's where soul comes in. The Darwinian. They've been built on this mechanical model, the hierarchy, putting people in boxes, chain of command, and competition. Above all, that the only way to move ahead, and capitalism always wants to grow, right, is to compete more and more and more. And now evolution biologists is showing us that the competition is like the early phase. That's how you get going. You establish territory in nature. You acquire enough territory and resources to grow your family, to establish yourself. But there comes a time for every species in nature when constantly having to beat off the competition is going to use up so much energy that it's exhausting, and it starts to fall apart. And then you discover that cooperation takes way less energy, that in the end you find it's cheaper to feed your enemies than to kill them off. And organizations like BALI, the Business Alliance for Local Living Economies, which we started at the Social Venture Network maybe 20 years ago at least, is all about looking at the different businesses in the community, cooperating with each other, feeding each other. The waste of one may be the food of another. And then the soul comes in from the connectedness when you say, wow, the other businesses aren't necessarily my enemies. They can be my friends, and wow, what we can do together with each other. And so a lot of freedom comes out of the connections, putting the soul back through connections. I believe soul is really about this communion of connection.
I could not agree more. I think that's exactly what it is. And what we experience as separation is actually just a manifestation of a single unity that takes different form. So the idea of communion is about reintegration in many ways. And I love the distinction to make about energy allocation. It takes more energy to compete than it does to cooperate. I've never heard anybody actually put it that way before. And I love that distinction. That's beautiful.
Well, I remember back in the Vietnam War, we used to say, why don't we just buy up Vietnam and develop it? It would be much cheaper than destroying it. And it's true. It costs more, but unfortunately, war is part of our capitalist system, and we've made it very, very profitable. It's war and drugs are the most profitable industries on the planet.
That is absolutely true. Unfortunately, and it is. I mean, it's right back to the beginning when I said that capitalism has gone off the rails. If I go back to Adam Smith, right at the beginning, the theory of moral sentiment, which informed his writing on the Wealth of Nations, was about the invisible hands, and it was about connection. It was about reciprocal and symbiotic work. And that was, the genesis of trade, as far as a first writing of it. So that is a really
That's
interesting.
such an important observation. Yeah, let's stay on that point for a while,
Yes.
because we translated the invisible hand into something very, very different. We translated it into no regulations. You know, there's an invisible hand running this, and it's all going to be okay if we're completely free to do whatever we want, right?
Yes.
But nature insists on a lot of responsibility with freedom. When our brains exploded into the human form, we lost knowing what to do. Other creatures know what to do. They know how to find mates and how to govern themselves and form community and all those things. And we got this freedom. And then, you know, in the US, the motto kind of became, don't fence me in, don't make any rules for me.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas in other parts of the world, freedom is the freedom to accomplish things, knowing the constraints, knowing the responsibility that it takes to do things.
Yes, and it's not a zero-sum process. Yeah, and what I mean by, I mean, there was a study, not a study, but there's a ranking that came out today in one of my news feeds, looking at the happiest and healthiest and most successful societies on the planet today. Finland, again, was number one, and not accidentally, their whole ethos. And I've spent a lot of time in Finland when I was working with Nokia. And actually the author of one of the papers that I read today, Jorma Ollila, was the CEO of Nokia at that time. But the idea there in the ethos of Finnish society is harmony, collaboration. It's not necessarily cutthroat competition, and they are exquisitely, I mean, truly, you know, quite good from an economic perspective at, you know, working in the world. But they have, in many ways, a living economy that is looking for how can all benefit, not just a select 1%. How can all benefit? And that notion of the invisible hand, there are, you know, regulations, there are laws, there are things that need to be attended to that are designed not to be onerous, not to be limiting, you know, to an extreme, but are designed to foster well-being. And that, I think, is generated when we start touching into what's the soul of business about. Business has a responsibility to take care of the whole, I think.
Huge. The best opportunity and the biggest responsibility. It is, in fact, the only thing that can save us.
I believe that's right.
It's through business is how we manage our affairs on the planet, and nature's been doing business for billions of years. What is business? It's about acquiring resources and transforming them to something useful or edible, and then distributing them and consuming them, and in nature recycling them. And unfortunately, part of Western science has been a linear model. Mm-hmm. And I don't mean a cradle to grave model, but a linear one where it's from acquisition to tossing out.
Yeah, it doesn't complete a loop where recycling comes back into the process.
Yeah, our heavy industry wastes over 96% of what it takes out of the ground, becomes slag heaps and, you know, throwaway. And then the metal that we get from it, or what's in the 4%, ends up in landfills somewhat later. You know, that's not the way nature does a living economy.
No. So that living economy meme, how would you, in a simple sentence or a simple capture point here, describe what you mean by a living economy for those that are listening, so that they've got a real good grasp of what this is about?
When you learn from nature, as obviously all indigenous societies were so obviously and recognizable to themselves, part of nature, in nature, we've tended to separate ourselves, to think of ourselves as living in an environment, which we see as a collection of resources for human use, rather than as one participant species in what uncountable numbers of species are doing. And for instance, in your body, if you tried to do business the way we do in your body, you'd maybe call the heart-lung system the northern industrial organs north of the diaphragm. And then the rest of the body, in the bones, there are raw material blood cells that can be mined. And so let's say the northern industrial organs have the power to mine them, and in your body, actually, those raw material blood cells do come up to what I'm calling the northern industrial organ, because the blood there adds oxygen and refines things and then distributes it to the whole body. But if we did it our way, then the body price for blood would be announced from those northern industrial organs, and only the other parts of the body that could afford it could have the blood. And you see very quickly, you could teach a 6-year-old that what we're doing is not a living economy. Mm-hmm. It isn't recycling. It isn't distributing fairly. It isn't benefiting everything that participates. And our stakeholders are not only all humanity, as Tachi Kiyuchi pointed out when he was CEO of Mitsubishi America, and he's a good friend of mine who used to bring me to Japan to talk to business people. He pointed out that ultimately all other humans are your stakeholders, and I would add all other species are your stakeholders, everyone your business affects, right?
Yes.
So getting soul back, communing in, recognizing that we're not in an environment, we're part of an ecosystem, and that ecosystem ends up being the whole planet and perhaps the whole galaxy and universe.
There you go.
So the living economy, you learn from nature. We have this wonderful movement of biomimicry now that Janine Benyus got off the ground, where people are looking, at least in the business world, to make sensible materials that are natural and recyclable, mm-hmm. rather than clogging our planet with plastics. I won't go into a riff on that.
We can go down a very deep rabbit hole on that one too.
We're killing off our life support systems,
yeah,
right?
Truly.
And then we think we can solve it all with technology. Oh, we'll just make spaceships and go live somewhere else. Not so easily done. Right?
Who I am will follow me wherever I go. So if I don't get it fixed here, wherever I go, I'm going to replicate it. That's a crazy solution.
The little body economics model is helpful in seeing the difference between a living economy and an artificially constructed economy that's linear. So the first thing to make a living system happen is to delinearize your business economy, to make sure that there is a cradle to grave repeating cycle, mm-hmm. Where you reuse even what's in the grave, right?
Yeah, perfect. On that, I think that we are approaching our time limit here, so I could carry this conversation on. I would love to have you come back if you are open to that possibility.
I'd be happy to, and I'd say everyone who wants to make a better world, find what makes your heart sing and work from there so that you become an attractor, whether you're a poet or a gardener or a scientist or whatever. Become an attractor, gather more people to you, build local living economies, and recognize that nature operates on the same principles at all scales. So, as an indigenous woman said to me once, anyone who knows how to run a household knows how to run a world.
I love that. I love that. How can people find out more about you and your work with living economies? Is there a place that you can direct them?
Yeah. Well, my basic main book is called Earth Dance, Living Systems in Evolution. I have a newer, easier one out called Gaia's Dance, The Story of Earth and Us, a children's book for grown-ups. And you can find me Googling my name. There are lots of videos and things out there.
Okay, and I will have some of her information posted on the synopsis when I make this podcast available. So I want to thank again Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris. It's been an absolute pleasure and honor to have you on the show today, and I look forward to our next meeting. This has been Blaine Bartlett. So yes, The Soul of Business. I want to thank you for listening. You can find out more about The Soul of Business by going to my website, blainebartlett.com. The podcast is available at all of the regular places, iTunes, Spotify, and whatnot. The video portion of this podcast is also available on my YouTube channel. Look forward to comments. I look forward to hearing from you. And again, Dr. Elisabet Sahtouris, thank you very much for being my guest.
You're most welcome.